we just had a fabulous little break with Julie and the RDN talking about their strategy. And I wanted to introduce a slightly different process that we've taken just south of here in the Cowichan Valley Regional District. It's a large regional district. It goes from the east coast of Vancouver Island. We've got a couple of wonderful Gulf islands within our area all the way to the west coast. It has 17 large watershed groupings and an extremely wide diversity of issues facing our region. And so I really wanted to start it with an acknowledgement that all of us are from places which are different. There are some key threads that tie us together, but our communities and the faces and the voices that we hear that bring forward the story of place are very unique to our areas, and we need to really take that into consideration as we move forward. This is not moving forward. Oh, I thought it was on auto move. Oh, excellent. So I want to talk about the Cowichan process. And we just saw Tusilam, who's an elder with the Cowichan tribes, who really talked about that sense of place, what the past was, the stories, and the relationships that are important. And so within the Cowichan, in early 2002, 2003, we were facing a major challenge with regards to water supply on the Cowichan River and our relationship with Catalyst Pulp and Paper Mill. And the Cowichan Stewardship Roundtable was formed as a community process to talk about the grief, the loss of water, the loss of future, the loss of culture, and how we move forward. And so the roundtable was formed to address primarily water supply in partnership with DFO, the province, and Catalyst. It's a stewardship roundtable that's been meeting for well over 10 years. It meets every single month. And over its period of time, they've made the decision to never take a single penny of funding directly. It's a collaborative, it is not a competition. They have a 100-year visionary strategy and actions to make their vision for the future something which is specific. One of those things was the Stoltz slide issue, which had 3% egg to fry survival below the slide and approximately 80% above the slide. It was a massive issue. BC Parks property, but BC Parks has a different piece around ecosystem restoration and letting things go naturally. However, the impact was enormous on the fishery, enormous on the resource, and enormous on the sense of place. What is it like to swim in gray, silty water versus blue water? What does that look like at a community level? Nobody owned the problem, everybody owned a part of the solution. And so the group came together working with the upland property owners, Timber West at the time, now under new management, fabulous partner, Catalyst, fabulous partner, BCCF and others came together to do the largest in-river restoration in Canada's history. It moved the Cowichan River entirely from its trajectory, rebuilt the slope, put in constructed features which bring back the color blue to Cowichan and our ability to see fisheries. In the early 2000s, there was also the development at the regional district of some capacity, limited though it was at the time. It was the first time the regional district said, perhaps environment is important, perhaps we need to address sustainability from a different perspective than we have in the past, which is really focused on building an economic driver for our region. It's a beautiful place. It is a beautiful place to have industry located. It's a beautiful place for communities to come together. But we really wanted to look at what the future was. And so Sustainable Cowichan was born, the 12 big ideas, and the notion of leadership, resilience, and in many ways, restorative development. A conversation started to happen within the region. So shortly after that, the Cowichan Basin Water Management Plan was tabled. 89 quote-unquote simple recommendations. Raising the Cowichan Weir, increasing storage is just one recommendation, which really focused on spheres of influence, not necessarily one organization being in charge, one community bearing the load, but identifying all of the stakeholders that needed to be at the table. We also have here Waterwoman, who's our local champion. In our community, we have a superhero who gets out, speaks to kids, works with communities in a very different way. And so that's the beginning of our recognition that each of our watersheds, you heard a little bit about the challenges with the Comox Valley yesterday. Well, the Cowichan is a heritage river. It is one of the key index rivers that drives the U.S. Canada Salmon Treaty in terms of the catch quota from California to Alaska. It's important. It's important to our community. It's important to our countries. We also had, towards the end of the early 80s, a growing recognition of the importance of Cowichan tribes playing a key role. They're only one of a number of First Nations within our region. They are the largest First Nation in the province, and their concerns with declining fisheries, as well as their concern with increasing flood risk. And so part of that process was the first integrated flood management strategy using what was at that point in time, novel and analytical techniques using LiDAR and three-dimensional models, playing what if with various communities, and not just looking at infrastructure, but looking at the values that infrastructure can bring to us in terms of that partnership. So the photo that you've got here, while it may look like gray infrastructure, it is a reconnection of the side channels in the lower Cowichan and Comox Valley floodplain that had been cut off in the 1950s when the first dikes were built. These channels are now re-wetted and resupplied and provide a phenomenal heartthrob, if you will, to the resiliency of the Cowichan system, providing a future, hopefully, for the fisheries. At the same time, at the regional level, the communities came together and said, in order for us to manage where we want to go in the future, we need to understand where we are now so that we can put in strategic process. And Storm spoke last night about what's the point of a strategy. We can build strategies, but what we really want is success at the end of that. And so to understand where we are now helps us understand where we've been, to listen to those voices, and to be clear about where we want to go. Again, looking at, and Ted spoke yesterday about understanding the importance of agriculture and the needs of agriculture for water within our watersheds so that we can understand the tension and be able to really speak frankly around those tensions to find solutions. And so the region undertook a large, long-term strategy around understanding agricultural water use. And slightly differently than the rest of the province, we said we were not only interested in the designated agricultural lands, but we wanted to understand all of the land because at some point in time it may become agricultural. So we took a long view on that. We started in the early 2000s to build the database in terms of water quality and understanding water supply and flow with the Ministry of Environment at the time. And so we've built a database, and that database has been built both by staff within the region, but as well as communities. And we've got so many communities in our region that have an appetite for volunteering that we've created this desire to understand the systems more effectively. What we didn't have at the time was a key, what I would call an architecture at the local government level, because as a regional district, we cannot take on additional works without public approving it through referendum. So we're talking about governance at the local government level. We're talking about urgency. We're talking about what happens when the Cowichan River goes dry and we have to start putting plans in place to pump water out of a lake and draw it down to levels where it's never been before in order to provide water for fish to come up the system. And so this is the emergency plans in place. We need to speak to our, not just to the stewardship groups and our municipal partners, but we need to speak to all of the First Nations. And so we have undertaken a multi-year process to talk about governance and providing input into what is that sense of place, what is the relationship and role. So we're getting there, I promise. We need to start developing tools to share that information more effectively. So how do we take all of this information, which is buried in filing cabinets and historic records? It needs to be made live again. And so really struggling with how do we put it into a publicly accessible framework. We've done that. We're looking at the impacts of climate change, and rather than simply saying the climate is changing, we need to understand specifically how is it changing? How is it different from one part of our region to the other? What's the impact on our infrastructure, on our ability to provide key services as a local government, never mind the key services that the watersheds and the landscapes provide us? And so we undertook, in partnership with the province and the Pacific Climate Impact Solutions, a downscaled climate projection for a region that looks at various futures at a grid level of 800-meter grid cells, so that we can understand the difference between what happens at the top of the watershed and what happens at the lower end of the watershed, and what happens on one side of our region versus the other, so that we can be specific. We've also worked with other consulting groups to understand, and this is an example here of an area within our region that is growing incredibly quickly. We do not have a regional growth strategy. Growth is driven by demand within our community, and we understand now that we are approving development in areas where there is no potable water future in the very near future. The supply for those areas is already at its threshold. So what do? We listen to the elders. We listen to Chief Livingston talk about what it's like, and this is a shot of her on a rainy day in Lake Cowichan talking about the impact of loss of supply, the loss of culture of a community. We talk about putting things into model and valuing certain components of it, and historically this is a process that we've just undertaken in terms of long-term water supply, raising storage, potentially flooding out properties around Lake Cowichan. And typically, as a kind of an engineering perspective, we look at what's the cost. How do we choose the right decision based on the cost? This process allowed us to look at the cost to our values as a community as well as a holistic process. We've also just completed a process, and you'll see SNC-Lavalin here, which is very political for many of you, but they're also a phenomenal engineering company that allowed us to say, here's our region, let's look at it at a watershed level. What's the risk within our region at a watershed and a community level, so that we can make the most strategic investments in the most appropriate places with the tools that we have. And so we went, not 10 years ago, but we went last fall to the public, and we said, we think the time is right. Our communities have been with us all the way through this process as community stewards and scientists, to be able to build a need for local government to actually be there as a warehousing, as a component of a long-term strategy. But we have a specific role in the community, and our other partners have specific roles. And so the referendum passed. We have been given a year to come up with a nominal strategy going forward, which includes public participation, and so we'll be rolling that out over the next few months, probably in tandem with the RDN, but it's a very different process within our region, and I think that we need to recognize that each of the watersheds is unique, so that's where we are.